She's been nothing but a financial liability to our family. No real career, no assets, just living off the Wilson name. James's voice echoed through the Boston courtroom as he testified, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his composure never wavering. Next to him, his attorney nodded solemnly, glancing at the folder of meticulously prepared financial statements. Across the room, his mother Victoria sat with perfect posture, a slight smile playing on her lips. She'd been waiting for this moment for 7 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white as I listened to my husband of 6 years dismiss my existence. Our life together. The countless hours I'd spent managing his schedule, hosting his clients, attending every Wilson family function with the appropriate smile. All reduced to financial liability. I caught my attorney Katherine's sideways glance, a silent reminder to maintain my composure. Furthermore, James continued, straightening his red tie, any settlement should reflect her minimal contributions to our marriage and her complete lack of independent means. The judge glanced my way, perhaps wondering how I'd respond to being portrayed as essentially worthless. That's when the bailiff approached, handing Katherine a sealed envelope. Time-sensitive document for Emma Bennett-Wilson, he announced. Katherine frowned, examining the official seal before quietly passing it to me. As I broke the seal, a document bearing the letterhead of Fairchild Trust Management slid out. My eyes widened as I scanned the contents, then passed it back to Katherine. She read it, looked up at me, then stood. Your Honor, if I may, we've just received notification that will significantly impact these proceedings. She paused, looking directly at James. My client has inherited assets valued at approximately $70 million from her great-aunt Eleanor Bennett's estate, effective as of 9 a.m. this morning. The courtroom fell silent. James's perfect composure cracked, his mouth opening, slightly. His mother's smile vanished. And in that moment, I realized something profound. I was finally free. Not because of the money, but because I'd finally seen the Wilsons for exactly who they were. The first time I met James Wilson was at a charity auction in downtown Boston, 6.5 years ago. I'd been working for a boutique marketing firm that specialized in luxury brands, and the event was crawling with potential clients. My boss had practically shoved me toward the bar where the whales were gathering, her term for the city's wealthiest prospects. Just be yourself, she'd said, straightening my simple black dress. But maybe be a slightly more sophisticated version of yourself. I'd laughed at that. Growing up in a middle-class family in Worcester, sophistication wasn't exactly my birthright. My parents, a high school math teacher and a nurse, had raised me with solid values and encouraged my education. But navigating Boston's elite social circles was something I'd had to learn on the job. The man who would become my husband stood slightly apart from the loud finance bros at the center of the group. Tall, with thoughtful brown eyes and an easy smile, he wasn't what I expected from one of Boston's banking heirs. When I'd awkwardly attempted to discuss our firm's services, he'd steered the conversation toward my background instead. Marketing seems like an interesting field, he'd said, sipping his whiskey. What drew you to it? I'd been surprised by his genuine interest. Most potential clients only wanted to talk about themselves. I like finding the story behind products and services, I'd replied honestly. Everything has value if you understand what it means to the right people. He'd smiled at that. That's an interesting perspective. Most people in my world just focus on the monetary value. And what world is that? I'd asked. Banking? Family business. Terribly boring at parties. He'd extended his hand. James Wilson. Wilson. Even I recognized the name. Wilson Financial Group was one of Boston's old money institutions, managing Wealth for generations of New England families. And just like that, I understood why my boss had been so eager for me to mingle. But James hadn't seemed like a whale to be landed. He'd been easy to talk to, asking thoughtful questions about my work and background. When he'd asked for my number at the end of the evening, I'd given it without hesitation, thinking it might lead to a client relationship. Instead, it had led to dinner the following week, then weekend trips to the Cape, then meeting his family at their compound in Chatham, an experience that should have been my first warning. Victoria Wilson had greeted me with a perfectly practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Slim, elegant, with silver-streaked blonde hair in an immaculate bob, she'd assessed me from head to toe in seconds. "Emma, what a pleasure," James tells us. "You work in advertising." "Marketing, actually," I'd corrected gently. "Oh yes, of course." The dismissal in her tone had been subtle, but unmistakable. "Richard, darling, James has brought his friend." Richard Wilson, a distinguished man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, had barely looked up from his newspaper. "Wonderful," he'd murmured before returning to his reading. That first weekend had established the pattern for my relationship with the Wilsons. James was attentive and warm when we were alone, but in his family's presence, he became someone different. More reserved, more concerned with appearances, more Wilson. I'd met Andrew, James's older brother, and his wife Megan later that day. Andrew had embodied everything I'd expected from a banking heir, confident to the point of arrogance, focused on status and connections, constantly checking his phone. Megan, however, had surprised me with a genuine welcome. "Don't worry. About dinner," she'd whispered when Victoria had disappeared to discuss the menu with their chef. "No matter what you wear, it'll be wrong. Just come comfortable." She'd been right. My carefully chosen cocktail dress had been too bright, according to Victoria's subtle frown. The conversation had flowed around me, full of references to people and places I didn't know. Every time I'd tried to contribute, Victoria had found a way to redirect the discussion. "Oh, Emma has such unique perspectives. But Andrew, tell us about the Harrison account." By the end of the weekend, I'd felt exhausted but also determined. James had apologized as we'd driven back to Boston. "My family can be a bit intense. They've just always had a specific vision for how things should be." "I'm not exactly what they envisioned for you," I'd observed. He'd reached for my hand. "That's what I like about you. You're real in a way most people in my world aren't." I'd believed him then. Believed that our connection was strong enough to withstand his family's subtle disapproval. Believed that he valued me precisely because I wasn't what they'd expected. How naive I'd been. Our engagement, 11 months later, had prompted a complex reaction from the Wilsons. Publicly, they'd been supportive, hosting an elegant engagement party at the Cape Cod compound and including the announcement in the Boston Globe's society pages. Privately, Victoria had initiated what I came to think of as the refinement project. "Emma, darling," she'd said during one of our casual lunches at her club, "I've taken the liberty of connecting you with Monica Stevens. She's marvelous with wardrobe consultation. The Wilson family has certain social obligations, and I know you'll want to present yourself appropriately." Each suggestion had been framed as helpful guidance rather than criticism. Each gift had come with implicit instructions. The membership at Victoria's salon, the interior decorator who just happened to be available when James and I purchased our Beacon Hill brownstone, the gentle redirections whenever I mentioned continuing my career after marriage. "Of course you can work, darling," though most Wilson wives find their social and charitable obligations quite fulfilling. Time with clients is so important for the men's business connections. James had encouraged me to humor his mother. "She means well," he'd insisted, "and it's easier to go along than fight over every detail." So I'd adapted. My colorful wardrobe had gradually been replaced with muted tones that Victoria deemed classic. My circle of friends had narrowed to those the Wilsons considered appropriate. My career aspirations had shifted from advancement to accommodation, taking on fewer clients to be available for James's business dinners and family functions. The wedding itself had been a production worthy of a Society magazine spread, which it had received. 300 guests, most of whom I barely knew. A historic church. Reception at the most exclusive venue in Boston. I'd felt like an actress, in an elaborate play, saying lines and hitting marks that someone else had determined. My parents had seemed uncomfortable amidst all the opulence, though they'd put on brave faces for my sake. My father, in his first tailored suit, had whispered to me during our dance, "Just remember who you are, Emmy, no matter what name you're taking." I should have held tighter to his words. Instead, I'd let myself be gradually transformed into what the Wilsons needed me to be, the appropriate wife who enhanced James's image without overshadowing it, the gracious hostess who remembered clients' children's names and wine preferences, the charitable committee member who wrote checks and attended functions without making waves. Only with my great-aunt Eleanor had I remained fully myself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor Bennett had been the family rebel, my grandmother's sister who'd never married, built a successful investment portfolio from a modest inheritance, and traveled extensively into her 80s. When I was growing up, her visits had been highlights of the year, bringing stories of distant places and perspectives that expanded my world. After my marriage, our visits had continued, though I'd needed to schedule them carefully around Wilson, family obligations. Eleanor's small apartment in Providence had become a refuge where I could speak freely, dress comfortably, and drop the increasingly exhausting performance of Mrs. James Wilson. "You're disappearing, Emma," she'd observed during a visit in my 4th year of marriage, her bright eyes sharp despite her advancing age. "Each time I see you, there's less of the girl I've always adored." I'd tried to dismiss her concern. "I'm just adapting to James's world. It's different from how I grew up." "Adaptation is necessary," she'd agreed. "Erasure is not. Don't let them convince you that your value lies in how well you can blend into their wallpaper." I should have listened more carefully. Instead, I'd assured her things were fine, that I was happy, that the compromises were worth it for the life James and I were building. But even as I'd spoken those words, I'd realized I was no longer certain they were true. The first significant crack in my marriage had appeared during a dinner with Richard and Victoria in our 3rd year together. James had been describing a new financial product Wilson Financial was developing when I'd asked a question about the risk assessment model they were using. The table had gone silent. 3 pairs of Wilson eyes had turned to me in surprise. "It's just..." I'd hesitated, already regretting speaking up. "The model sounds similar to what failed during the 2008 crisis. There's an interesting analysis in this month's Financial Times about the flaws in that approach." Richard had recovered first. "I wasn't aware you followed financial publications." "Emma." "Just occasionally," I'd mumbled, feeling James's tension beside me. "I find some of the concepts interesting." Victoria had smoothly changed the subject, but later that night, James had been uncharacteristically distant. "You embarrassed my father tonight," he'd finally said as we'd prepared for bed. "By asking a question? By questioning his business? Judgment in front of my mother. There are channels for that kind of input, Emma. Private ones. Dad's been in finance for 40 years. He doesn't need his daughter-in-law pointing out flaws in his strategy over roast duck." I'd apologized more, shaken by James's reaction than I wanted to admit. From that point forward, I'd been more careful about expressing opinions on the Wilson business, even as I privately continued to read and learn about finance and investments. It had become a secret hobby, analyzing market trends, following investment strategies, even making small investments from the modest inheritance my grandparents had left me. Those private moments of intellectual engagement had sustained me as my public role became increasingly constrained. but they'd also highlighted the growing distance between the person I presented to the world and the person I was inside. A distance that had become impossible to ignore in our 5th year of marriage, when I'd discovered James's text messages. The name Sophia P. had appeared repeatedly on his phone over several months. At first, I'd thought nothing of it. James had many colleagues and clients, but the timing of the messages, late evenings, weekends when he was supposedly at the office, had eventually triggered my suspicion. One night while he'd been showering, I'd checked his phone. The messages had been everything I'd feared and, worse, not just evidence of an affair, but discussions of a future together. Mentions of Victoria's approval and support. References to their shared history and connections. A quick search had revealed Sophia P. to be Sophia Parker, James's college girlfriend from a family with deep connections to the Wilsons. The woman Victoria had always hoped James would marry before he'd met me. The woman who understood the Wilson world because she'd been born into it. I hadn't confronted James immediately. Instead, I'd started paying closer attention, noticing patterns I'd previously ignored. The late meetings that never appeared on the company calendar. The weekend conferences with no digital footprint. The subtle shifts in James's behavior. More distracted, more critical of me, more aligned with his family's expectations. As I'd gathered evidence of the affair, I'd also discovered other disturbing information. Financial documents James had carelessly left accessible showed that Wilson Financial had been engaging in questionable practices, moving client funds through offshore accounts to obscure losses from high-risk investments. My growing financial literacy had made the implications clear. The Wilsons were protecting themselves at their clients' expense. The weight of these discoveries had left me sleepless for weeks. The marriage I'd worked so hard to maintain was a facade. The family I'd tried so desperately to please was not only rejecting me, but actively planning my replacement. The business I'd defended was built on deception. During this period, I'd visited Eleanor more frequently, finding solace in her straightforward wisdom. Though I hadn't revealed the full extent of my marital problems, her insights had helped me gain perspective. The trouble with marrying into wealth, she'd observed during one of our afternoon teas, is that people who inherit privilege often believe they've earned it. They mistake luck for merit and confuse appearance with substance. At 92, Eleanor had remained sharp as ever, though her health had been clearly declining. During what would be our final visit, she'd held my hand with surprising strength. "You've always cared more about people than possessions, Emma. That's your true inheritance from our side of the family. Don't let anyone convince you it's worth less than their money." She'd passed away 3 weeks later, as the Wilson family had been preparing for their annual charity gala at the Cape Cod compound. Victoria had been unsympathetic about my grief. "Of course you should attend the funeral, Emma, but surely you can be back in time for the gala. The governor will be there, and you know how important these connections are for James." I'd gone to Providence for the small, intimate service, surrounded by the few people who had truly known and loved Eleanor. Among them had been Eleanor's attorney, Martin Fairchild, who had asked me to meet him privately the following week. "Your aunt made some changes to her will recently," he'd explained in his Providence office. "She asked me not to discuss the details until after her passing, and for the changes to take effect only after a specific date." I'd been surprised, but not focused on the implications. Eleanor had left me small mementos before, books from her travels, a vintage brooch I treasured. I'd assumed this would be similar. "I don't want to burden Emma while she's dealing with that family," Martin had read from Eleanor's letter. "But I've watched how they've diminished her spirit over the years. I've seen her intelligence and potential stifled by their narrow expectations. So I've structured my bequest to serve as a lifeline when she most needs it, when she finds the courage to reclaim herself." I'd listened in confusion as Martin had explained that Eleanor had left me her entire estate, the culmination of decades of shrewd investing and careful management. The estate would transfer to me on what would have been her 93rd birthday, exactly 6 months from our meeting. She believed you would need resources of your own, Martin had explained, though she hoped you might find your way to independence even before the inheritance became available. I'd left his office in a daze, the knowledge of Eleanor's extraordinary gift competing with the painful reality of my marriage. By the time I'd returned to Boston, I'd made a decision. I would use the next 6 months to prepare, financially, emotionally, legally, for the end of my marriage to James. But I would tell no one about the inheritance until I was ready. The Wilson Charity Gala had proceeded as scheduled 3 days after Eleanor's funeral. I'd attended as expected, wearing the appropriate gown in the appropriate shade of midnight blue that Victoria had deemed suitable for someone in light mourning. As I'd moved through the crowd, glass of champagne in hand, smiling at the right moments, I'd felt like I was watching myself from a distance, this polished, hollow version of Emma Bennett who had learned to perform Wilson wife so convincingly. James had barely spoken to me all evening, too busy charming potential clients and keeping the governor engaged. I'd noticed him checking his phone repeatedly, a slight smile appearing each time. I'd known without looking that Sophia was on the other end of those messages. Victoria had approached during a brief lull, her cream-colored gown impeccable, her diamonds catching the light. "Emma, darling, you seem distracted. I know you're still upset about your aunt, but do try to engage. The Prestons are considering moving their considerable portfolio to Wilson Financial, and they specifically asked about you." "Did they?" I'd asked, genuinely surprised. "Well, no," Victoria had admitted. "But if they do, you should appear interested and appropriate. First impressions, darling." As she'd moved away to adjust a floral arrangement that didn't need adjusting, I'd caught sight of James in conversation with Andrew and Richard, their heads bent together, expressions serious. Richard had glanced my way, then said something that made James nod grimly. Later that night, I'd overheard a conversation between Victoria and James in Richard's study, where I'd gone to find a quiet moment away from the crowd. "It needs to be handled carefully," Victoria had been saying. "The prenup is solid, but public perception matters for the business. We need a narrative that preserves the Wilson reputation." "I know, Mother," James had replied, sounding tired. "After the Sanderson acquisition closes next month, before the fiscal year ends." "Sophia understands the need for discretion," Victoria had continued. "Once everything is finalized with Emma, you can begin appearing together publicly. We'll frame it as a reconnection between old friends after an appropriate interval." I'd slipped away before they could discover me, my heart pounding despite having suspected this for months. They were planning the end of my marriage, the timeline of my disposal, the PR strategy for my replacement, all without my knowledge or input. As if I were a business problem to be managed rather than a person whose life was being shattered. That night, after returning to our Beacon Hill home, I'd watched James sleeping peacefully beside me and made my final decision. I would not wait for them to orchestrate my exit. I would not allow them to control the narrative of my marriage's end. I would prepare, gather evidence, and when Eleanor's inheritance became available, I would leave on my terms. For the next 5 months, I'd lived a double life. Outwardly, I'd continued to be the perfect Wilson wife, attending functions, managing our home, smiling through dinners where Victoria critiqued everything from my clothing to my conversational topics. Privately, I'd consulted with Katherine Rodriguez, a divorce attorney recommended by a former colleague as both discreet and formidable. I'd documented James's affair, copied evidence of Wilson Financial's questionable practices, and quietly moved personal items of sentimental value to a small apartment I'd rented in Cambridge under my maiden name. I'd also reconnected with my old marketing colleagues, laying groundwork for potential client relationships once I was free to work without Wilson restrictions. My plan had been to file for divorce myself when Eleanor's inheritance became available, using the financial independence it would provide to counter the Wilson family's inevitable attempts to control the process. but James had acted first. 3. Weeks before the inheritance was set to transfer, he'd informed me over breakfast, between bites of toast and without looking up from his phone, that he was filing for divorce. "It's for the best, Emma," he'd said, as if discussing a business decision. "We've been growing apart for some time. My attorney will be in touch with details." I'd sat frozen, my coffee cup halfway to my lips, stunned not by the fact of the divorce, but by the casual cruelty of his delivery. 6 years of marriage dismissed between breakfast and his morning commute. "Is there someone else?" I'd asked, needing to hear him say it. He'd had the grace to look uncomfortable, if only briefly. "That's not relevant to our situation. We want different things. We always have." His use of the Wilson family "we" had said everything. He'd already returned to their fold completely, viewing our marriage through their lens of convenience and strategy rather than commitment and care. The divorce proceedings had moved quickly, exactly as the Wilsons had planned. James's attorneys had been aggressive, citing the prenuptial agreement I'd signed and characterizing me as a financial dependent who had contributed nothing of value to the marriage. They'd pushed for minimal spousal support and no claim to any Wilson assets or property. Katherine had advised patience. "They're rushing because they have something to hide," she'd observed. "Let them think they're winning. We have time." And that time had run out exactly as James had been testifying about my supposed worthlessness at our final hearing, the hearing where Eleanor's inheritance had finally been announced. Now, sitting in the courtroom as the implications of the inheritance sank in, I watched James consult frantically with his attorney. Victoria, in the gallery, had turned an alarming shade of red beneath her perfect makeup. Richard simply looked calculating, already considering how this new development might be leveraged or managed. Katherine leaned toward me, speaking quietly. "This changes the dynamics considerably. With your own substantial assets, the prenup's restrictive clauses about spousal support become less relevant. More importantly, you now have resources to fight any attempt to enforce the confidentiality provisions they were using to prevent you from discussing their business practices." The judge cleared her throat. "In light of this new information, I suggest a recess for both parties to reconsider their positions. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9. As we gathered our things, James approached, his expression a mixture of shock and calculation that I'd once found charming, but now recognized as the mask it had always been. "Emma," he said quietly, ensuring no one else could hear. "We should discuss this privately. There's no need for things to become adversarial." I met his gaze directly, feeling a strength I hadn't realized I still possessed. "I believe your mother already made things adversarial when she planned my replacement, while I was still planning our anniversary dinner." His eyes widened slightly. "You knew about Sophia? The divorce timeline?" "Yes, for months." I smiled, not unkindly. "You really should change your phone password more often, James." His expression hardened. "So this is revenge? Using your windfall to punish me?" "No," I replied truthfully. "This is liberation. Eleanor understood what I needed before I did. The resources to walk away on my own terms." Victoria appeared at James's elbow, her composure partially restored though tension radiated from her rigid posture. "Emma, dear, what a surprising development. Perhaps we should all have dinner tonight and discuss the situation like family." The audacity was so typically Victoria that I almost laughed. 5 hours ago, she'd been prepared to see me walk away with nothing. Now that I had resources, I was suddenly family again. "Thank you, Victoria, but I have plans this evening." I gathered my purse and coat. Katherine will be in touch with James's attorneys regarding a fair settlement, one that acknowledges both my contributions to the marriage and my right to speak freely about my experiences. As I walked out of the courtroom, past the stunned Wilson family, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the lightness of being truly myself again. Not Emma Wilson, the carefully constructed society wife, but Emma Bennett, the woman, with her own value, voice, and now, the means to rebuild on her own terms. Eleanor's gift wasn't just financial independence. It was the opportunity to reclaim my identity and potential, to find out who I could become when I was no longer diminished by the Wilsons' narrow expectations. As I stepped into the bright Boston afternoon, I knew exactly where I was headed. To the small Cambridge apartment where I'd begun gathering the pieces of my true self, ready at last to build something authentic from the ground up. The next morning, I woke in my Cambridge apartment feeling truly rested for the first time in months. The space was modest, a one-bedroom with large windows and worn hardwood floors. But it was mine in a way the Beacon Hill brownstone had never been. No Victoria-approved decorator had selected the furnishings. No Wilson family portraits lined the walls. Here, I'd begun assembling fragments of my authentic self. Books I actually wanted to read rather than display. A colorful quilt my fee. Grandmother had made. The small watercolor paintings I'd started creating again after years of abandoning my artistic hobbies. As I prepared for the day's court appearance, I chose my outfit carefully. A tailored navy pantsuit I'd purchased without Victoria's guidance, accessorized with Eleanor's vintage jade brooch. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman, staring back at me. Not because she looked so different from the Emma who had played Wilson wife for 6 years, but because her eyes contained a clarity and purpose I hadn't seen in far too long. My phone had been buzzing incessantly since yesterday's revelation. James had called 3 times, Victoria twice. Even Richard, who rarely communicated with me directly, had left a voicemail suggesting a family meeting before today's hearing. I'd ignored them all, speaking only with Katherine to prepare our strategy. "They're scrambling," she'd said during our evening call. "James's attorney has already reached out about a private settlement. They're suddenly very interested in keeping things amicable." "And confidential, I'm sure," I'd added. "Exactly. They're offering significantly more than their original proposal, but with extensive non-disclosure provisions." I'd considered this, remembering all the Wilson family secrets I'd accumulated over 6 years. The questionable business practices, the manipulation of clients, the carefully maintained public image that masked private betrayals. "I don't want to weaponize information," I'd told Katherine. "That's their approach, not mine, but I won't be silenced either." This morning, as I gathered my things to meet Katherine at the courthouse, I felt a strange calm. Whatever happened today, I would face it as myself, not as the carefully crafted version of Emma that the Wilsons had molded. The courthouse corridors were already buzzing with whispers as I arrived. Boston's legal community was small, and news of a $70 million inheritance appearing in the middle of a Wilson divorce had apparently spread rapidly. Katherine met me at the entrance to our designated courtroom, her expression professional but with a hint of satisfaction. "They've submitted a revised proposal," she said, handing me a document folder. "Significantly more generous than yesterday's position." I skimmed the contents as we found our seats. The proposed settlement offered a substantial financial package and full ownership of the Beacon Hill home, property I had no desire to keep, given its associations with 6 years of gradual erasure. More telling were the confidentiality provisions, extensive. Clauses prohibiting me from discussing not only the settlement terms, but any aspect of Wilson Financial's business practices or the family's private matters. In essence, I was being offered wealth in exchange for perpetual silence. Before I could discuss it with Katherine, the Wilsons entered the courtroom. Richard led the procession, his expression stoic as always. Victoria followed, her cashmere suit and pearls projecting the calm confidence that had intimidated me for years. James came last, looking surprisingly disheveled for someone usually so attentive to appearances. As they took their seats, I felt Victoria's gaze assess me, noting my outfit, my posture, my composure. For the first time, I met her scrutiny without instinctively adjusting myself to better meet her expectations. The judge entered, and after brief preliminaries, addressed both legal teams. I understand the parties have been discussing a revised settlement agreement. Has any progress been made? James's attorney stood. Yes, Your Honor. We've submitted a generous proposal that we believe acknowledges Mrs. Wilson's new financial circumstances while providing a fair resolution for both parties. Katherine rose next. My client appreciates the revised offer, Your Honor, but has concerns about certain provisions, particularly regarding confidentiality. The judge nodded. Given the significant developments since yesterday, I'm inclined to allow both parties additional time to negotiate. Would you prefer a conference room or a recess of several days? Katherine glanced at me questioningly. We'd discussed this possibility, and I'd already made my decision. A conference room would be fine, Your Honor, I replied. I think it's time everyone spoke directly. 30 minutes later, we sat across from each other in a wood-paneled conference room, the Wilsons and their attorney on one side, Katherine and me on the other. The tension was palpable as documents were arranged and water glasses filled. James spoke first, his voice carefully modulated to project sincerity. Emma, we were all surprised by yesterday's development, but I want you to know that I'm glad for your good fortune. I hope we can use this opportunity to conclude our marriage respectfully. The calculated performance might once have swayed me, but now I recognized it for what it was. The same smooth delivery he used to reassure nervous investors or placate dissatisfied clients. Respectfully, I repeated, like planning my replacement. With Sophia while we were still married? Or discussing my disposal like a business problem with your parents? Victoria interjected before James could respond. Emma, dear, relationships end. It's unfortunate but hardly unique to your situation. The question now is whether we handle this transition like civilized people or create unnecessary drama. I studied her, noting the slight tightening around her eyes, the only indication that she wasn't as composed as she appeared. Civilized people, I said slowly. That's an interesting choice of words from someone who referred to me as a financial liability just yesterday. Business terminology sometimes enters our family discussions, Richard spoke up, his tone pragmatic. It's not personal, just habit from decades in finance. It felt personal when you were planning to leave me with virtually nothing after 6 years of marriage, I replied. It felt personal when Victoria was selecting my replacement while I was still hosting dinner parties for your clients. James shifted uncomfortably. The prenuptial agreement you signed. I understand contracts, James, I interrupted. I also understand that they're only as strong as their underlying integrity. Katherine has explained that your affair, combined with evidence of hidden assets not disclosed during the prenup process, provides substantial grounds to challenge its validity. This statement caused a subtle ripple across the Wilson side of the table. Their attorney leaned over to whisper something to Richard, whose expression darkened. Victoria attempted to regain control of the conversation. We're offering you a very generous settlement, Emma. The house, significant financial compensation, even ongoing health insurance coverage. Surely that addresses any concerns about fairness. I opened the folder containing their proposal and turned to the confidentiality section. My concerns aren't primarily financial, Victoria. They never were. My concern is that this agreement essentially purchases my silence about everything I've witnessed as a Wilson, from James's infidelity to the offshore accounts hiding client losses. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Richard's calm facade cracked slightly, his voice taking on an edge I rarely heard. Business discussions overheard during family dinners are hardly evidence of impropriety. You lack the financial expertise to understand complex investment strategies. I smiled faintly. Actually, I understand more than you might think. Those business magazines I read weren't just to appear interested in James's work. I've been studying finance for years, analyzing market trends, following investment patterns. It became something of a passion, though not one the Wilsons would have approved of. James was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. "You never mentioned any interest in finance." "I did once, at dinner with your parents. You told me afterward that I'd embarrassed your father and should keep such thoughts private." Katherine interjected smoothly. "My client is not interested in damaging Wilson Financial. She simply wants a fair resolution that doesn't require her to permanently surrender her right to speak about her own experiences." The Wilson attorney conferred briefly with Richard before addressing us. We could modify the confidentiality provisions to focus specifically on business matters while allowing Mrs. Wilson to discuss personal aspects of the marriage more freely. "That would be a start," Katherine acknowledged. "We also need to address the property division more equitably, regardless of my client's inheritance." As the attorneys began discussing specific terms, Victoria rose abruptly. "I need a moment of fresh air. Emma, would you join me?" The request surprised everyone, including me. After a moment's hesitation, I nodded and followed her into the hallway, curious about what she might say when not surrounded by lawyers and family. We walked silently to a small seating area near a window overlooking the courthouse plaza. Victoria settled onto a bench with perfect posture, gesturing for me to join her. "You've changed," she observed, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "I've remembered who I am," I corrected. She nodded slightly. "Perhaps that's more accurate. When James first brought you home, I saw someone malleable. Someone who could be shaped to fit our world with the right guidance." "You mean someone who could be diminished to avoid challenging your control?" Instead of the defensive response I expected, Victoria surprised me with a small, tight smile. "Control has been the defining principle of my life, Emma. My father lost our family fortune in a single bad investment when I was 16. We went from historic Beacon Hill property to a 2-bedroom apartment in Dorchester practically overnight. This glimpse into Victoria's past startled me. In 6 years, she'd never shared anything so personal. "I swore I would never be vulnerable like that again," she continued. "When I met Richard, I recognized someone with similar determination. Together, we rebuilt what my father lost, and I've spent 40 years ensuring the Wilson name means stability and success." "At any cost?" I asked quietly. "Security always has a price," she replied simply. I believed James understood that, the necessity of strategic decisions, even in personal matters. "Like replacing me with a more suitable wife?" Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Sophia comes from a family that understands our world. The merger," she caught herself. "The marriage would have strengthened both families. And that's all that matters? Strategic advantage? Not love or commitment or basic honesty? Those are luxuries, Emma. Pleasant when possible, but not foundational." I studied this woman who had intimidated me for years, seeing her clearly, perhaps for the first time, not a villain in my story, but someone shaped by her own fears and limited by her own rigid definitions of success. That's where we differ, Victoria. I believe integrity isn't a luxury, it's essential, and a life built on appearances rather than authenticity isn't security, it's a prison. She considered this, straightening an already perfectly straight pearl earring. "And now, with your inheritance, you have the freedom to maintain such idealistic positions." Eleanor's money didn't give me courage. It gave me options. The courage was always there, just buried under layers of Wilson expectations. We sat in silence for a moment before Victoria spoke again, her voice unusually reflective. "I sometimes wonder who I might have been without the fear of ending up like my parents, genteel poverty, relying on the charity of former friends." The vulnerability in her admission was so unexpected that I responded honestly. "It's not too late to find out." She straightened, the brief moment of openness disappearing as quickly as it had emerged. "We should return to the negotiations. Richard dislikes being left out of conversations." As we walked back toward the conference room, Victoria paused. "One thing, Emma. Whatever you think of me, of us, James did love you, in his way. He simply wasn't strong enough to choose that love over everything else we taught him to value." The revelation wasn't exactly surprising, but hearing Victoria acknowledge it brought a curious closure. "I know. That's why I stayed as long as I did. But love without courage isn't enough." The remainder of the negotiation proceeded with surprising efficiency. With the inheritance providing me financial independence, I could focus on what truly mattered. A clean break that allowed me to speak my truth while avoiding unnecessary vindictiveness. We eventually agreed on a settlement that included fair compensation for my contributions to the marriage, full ownership of my personal property, and items accumulated during our time together, and a confidentiality agreement limited to specific business details rather than my personal experiences. As the attorneys finalized the paperwork, James approached my side of the table, motioning toward the door. "Could we talk privately for a moment?" After a questioning glance at Katherine, who nodded, I followed him to a quiet alcove near the courtroom. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing before recognizing it as a calculated signal of vulnerability he employed when wanting to appear sincere. "I owe you an apology," he began. "Not just for Sophia, but for everything. For not standing up to my parents. For not seeing you. Really seeing you. For a long time." I searched his face, looking for the man I'd fallen in love with 6 years ago. He was still there, somewhere beneath the layers of Wilson expectations and training, but so thoroughly integrated into his family's value system that separation seemed impossible. "Why her?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for months. "Because your mother approved? Because she fits the Wilson image better than I ever could?" He looked away, confirming my suspicions even before he spoke. "It's complicated. Sophia and I have history. She understands certain pressures, certain expectations without needing explanations. She doesn't challenge you to be better." His eyes snapped back to mine, a flash of the real James briefly visible. "That's not fair, isn't it? You chose someone who reinforces your family's worldview rather than someone who might help you question it. That's your right. But let's be honest about what it means." He was quiet for a long moment. "I did love you, Emma. That wasn't a lie. I believe you. But you love the idea of being someone who could choose me more than you actually could be that person." The truth of this statement hung between us. Neither accusation nor absolution, but simple recognition of reality. "What will you do now?" he asked finally. "With the inheritance? With your life?" It was a genuine question, perhaps the first truly unscripted moment between us in years. "I'm going to figure out who Emma Bennett is when she's not trying to be someone else's version of herself." I smiled faintly, starting with moving back to my maiden name. And Eleanor's money. 70 million is a lot of responsibility. Eleanor managed it brilliantly for decades. I'm going to honor that by being thoughtful about how I use it. Some for security, some for helping others, some for building whatever comes next. James nodded slowly. "You'll be good at that. You always saw value where others didn't." The irony of his statement, recognizing a quality in me that his family had systematically dismissed, wasn't lost on either of us. We returned to the conference room where the attorneys had prepared the final settlement documents. As I signed my name, Emma Bennett, rather than Emma Wilson, I felt the weight of the past 6 years lifting. Not erased or forgotten, but transformed from a burden into experience that would inform whatever came next. The Wilsons departed first, Richard with a brusque nod, Victoria with a complex glance that contained more acknowledgement than I'd ever received from her, James with a hesitant, regretful smile that I returned briefly before turning away. Outside, the courthouse, standing on the steps beneath a clear Boston sky, Katherine handed me the final copy of our agreement. "Congratulations, Emma. Not many people walk away from the Wilsons on their own terms. Not many people have a great-aunt Eleanor," I replied, thinking of her wisdom, her independence, her quiet rebellion against expectations. True, but the money only gave you options. You had to find the courage yourself. I thought about this as I made my way back to Cambridge, walking rather than taking a car, savoring the simple freedom of movement without schedule or scrutiny. Katherine was right. Eleanor's inheritance had provided practical means of escape, but the decision to reclaim myself had begun long before the money arrived. In small acts of resistance, in private moments of clarity, in the growing recognition that I deserved more than conditional acceptance. At the apartment, I opened windows to let in fresh spring air and made a cup of tea in the mismatched mug I'd picked up at a street market, the kind of casual purchase Victoria would have deemed tasteless, but that pleased me with its vibrant colors and imperfect shape. On the small desk by the window, I'd started gathering ideas for what might come next. Sketches for a potential marketing consultancy focused on businesses with social impact, notes on financial literacy programs for women leaving difficult, relationships, observations about investment strategies I'd been studying privately for years. Possibilities stretched before me, not defined by Wilson expectations or limitations, but by my own interests and values. At 35, I was starting over in many ways, but with resources, experience, and clarity I hadn't possessed before. My phone chimed with a message from Natalie, my oldest friend who had warned me about the Wilsons from the beginning. She'd been the first person I'd called after Eleanor's inheritance was announced in court. "Drinks tonight to celebrate your independence? The old gang wants to toast your escape from Boston's most controlling dynasty." I smiled, thinking of the friends I'd neglected during my years of Wilson-appropriate socializing. Creative, authentic. People who had accepted me long before I had a prestigious address or designer wardrobe. "Absolutely," I replied. "I have 6 years of real conversations to catch up on." As I set down my phone, I noticed Eleanor's photograph on my bedside table. Not the formal portrait the Wilsons had reluctantly displayed in a back hallway of our home, but a candid shot of her in her 70s, standing on a mountain in Nepal, gray hair blowing in the wind, arms outstretched in unabashed joy. "You were right," I told her image softly, "about everything." I imagined her response, practical, wise, slightly irreverent. "Being right isn't important, Emma. Being true to yourself is what matters. The rest is just details." The afternoon stretched before me, unscheduled and full of possibility. For the first time in years, I had nowhere to be, no one to impress, no role to play except the one I was still discovering, myself, undiminished and authentic. I opened my notebook and began writing, not plans or strategies, but simple truths I'd learned and wanted to remember, about the difference between price and value, about the costliness of silence, about the courage required to reclaim yourself after years of careful erasure. Tomorrow would bring practical decisions about money and careers and living arrangements. But today was for acknowledging the journey, from the eager young woman who had believed she could maintain her identity within the Wilson world to the stronger, clearer person who had found the courage to walk away. Outside my window, Boston continued its busy afternoon rhythm. Somewhere across town, the Wilsons were likely in crisis management mode, controlling the narrative, protecting the family image, strategizing next steps. Their world would continue, as precisely managed and appearance-focused as always. But I was no longer part of that world. My path forward would be messier, perhaps, less scripted, certainly, but authentically mine. Eleanor's financial legacy had given me freedom of choice, but the greater inheritance was the example of her life. Lived on her own terms, guided by her own values, rich with genuine connection and purpose. I lifted my mismatched mug in a silent toast to her memory, to the wisdom that had seen what I needed before I fully understood it myself. Then I turned to a fresh page in my notebook and wrote at the top, "What comes next?" The answer was still forming, but for the first time in years, the question itself felt like freedom. 3 months after the divorce settlement, I stood in the middle of my new Providence apartment, surrounded by moving boxes and the gentle afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was dramatically different from both the Cambridge rental and the Beacon Hill brownstone, a converted factory loft with exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and an open floor plan that felt like physical embodiment of the freedom I was still learning to embrace. Moving to Providence had been my first major decision after finalizing the divorce. The city held no Wilson connections or expectations, yet contained warm memories of Eleanor and her quiet rebellion against conventional paths. I'd purchased the loft outright, a strange feeling after years of James controlling our financial decisions, and had been gradually furnishing it with pieces that spoke to me rather than to some exterior standard of appropriateness. "This place is amazing," Natalie declared, setting down another box labeled kitchen. She surveyed the soaring ceilings and industrial windows. "Definitely not Wilson-approved decor." I laughed, the sound echoing slightly in the still sparse space. "Victoria would have a coronary. Too urban, too impractical, too statement-making. Exactly why it's perfect for the new Emma Bennett." Natalie flopped onto my newly delivered sofa, a deep emerald velvet piece I'd fallen in love with at first sight. "So, how does it feel to be a multimillionaire? Are you buying a yacht? Starting a diamond collection? Considering space tourism?" I rolled my eyes, unpacking books onto the built-in shelves that lined one wall. "Hardly. I'm being careful with Eleanor's money. It represents a lifetime of her smart decisions and independence. I don't want to squander that legacy." "Noble," Natalie replied, "but you're allowed to enjoy it too, you know. After 6 years of Victoria's approval being the household budget authority, you get to decide what matters to you." Her observation struck home. I'd spent so long adapting to Wilson priorities that establishing my own still felt like an act of rebellion rather than simple self-determination. "I am enjoying certain things," I admitted. "This apartment, not checking price tags at the grocery store, donating to causes the Wilsons would deem controversial. And the foundation idea?" Natalie prompted, reaching for the bottle of wine we'd opened during a break from unpacking. The foundation had been growing in my mind since the inheritance, a way to honor Eleanor while creating something meaningful from her gift. I'd spent the past month researching models and meeting with nonprofit consultants to shape the concept. "It's coming together," I explained, accepting the wine glass she offered. "The Eleanor Bennett Foundation for Women's Financial Independence, providing education, resources, and mentorship for women rebuilding after difficult relationships or life transitions." "Perfect," Natalie approved. "Practical, powerful, and guaranteed to make Victoria's eye twitch when she reads about it in the Boston Globe." I laughed again but shook my head. "This isn't about the Wilsons. It's about creating something that would have made Eleanor proud, something that extends the same lifeline she threw to me." Natalie's expression softened. "I know. I'm just enjoying the side benefit of imagining their reactions. After watching you shrink yourself for years to fit their expectations, seeing you build something that reflects your values is deeply satisfying." The foundation wasn't my only project. I'd also established Bennett Market Analytics, a small consultancy combining my marketing background with the financial knowledge I'd cultivated privately during my marriage. My first clients were women-owned businesses seeking to grow strategically, without losing their founding principles, work that felt personally meaningful while building on skills I'd developed but never fully utilized. As we continued unpacking, my phone buzzed with an email notification. Megan Wilson Taylor's name appeared on the screen, surprising me. Though she'd been a quiet ally during my years in the Wilson orbit, We hadn't spoken since the divorce finalization. "Mind if I take this?" I asked Natalie, who waved me toward the privacy of the unfinished bedroom. The email was brief, but direct. "Emma, in Boston next Tuesday for a design conference. Could we meet for coffee? There are things I'd like to discuss that might be mutual interest. No Wilson spy mission promise. Megan." I hesitated only briefly before responding with a cafe suggestion and proposed time. Despite her marriage to Andrew, Megan had always seemed like a reluctant Wilson, going through the motions of family loyalty while maintaining a private distance from their more controlling dynamics. Re-entering the main living area, I found Natalie arranging my collection of art books on the coffee table. "Wilson family communication?" she asked, noting my expression. "Megan wants to meet for coffee next week, says it's not a spy mission." "Which is exactly what a spy would say," Natalie observed wryly. "Maybe," I acknowledged, but Megan was always different from the rest. More authentic, less calculating. She tried to warn me about certain family patterns when James and I first got engaged. "And you're curious?" I nodded, returning to the box of kitchen items I'd been unpacking. "I am. Not about the Wilsons specifically, but about Megan. She always seemed trapped in that family in ways that echo how I felt." "Just keep your guard up," Natalie advised. "The Wilson influence has a way of seeping in when you least expect it." Her caution was reasonable, but as we finished arranging my new home that afternoon, I realized something important had shifted. The Wilsons no longer loomed as shadowy authority figures whose approval I unconsciously sought. They were simply people now, flawed, complex, but no longer defining my choices or self-perception. This new perspective was tested the following Tuesday as I entered the small cafe near Boston Common where I'd arranged to meet Megan. I'd chosen a public location with limited privacy, a precaution against whatever agenda might be behind the invitation. Megan was already seated at a corner table, looking surprisingly different from my last memory of her at a Wilson family function. Gone was the carefully styled blonde hair, replaced by a shorter, darker cut that framed her face more naturally. Her clothing was noticeably less formal, creative professional rather than banking dynasty wife. She rose as I approached, hesitating briefly before offering a hug rather than the air kiss that had been standard Wilson greeting protocol. "Emma, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I was curious," I admitted, settling into the chair across from her. "You look well. Different, but well." Megan smiled, touching her shortened hair self-consciously. "A lot has changed, but that's partly why I wanted to talk to you." A server took our orders, herbal tea for Megan, coffee for me, before she continued. "I'll be direct," she said, fidgeting slightly with her wedding ring. "I'm considering separating from Andrew. What you did, walking away from the Wilsons on your own terms, it made me realize certain things might be possible." The confession surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Megan and Andrew had always seemed more like business partners than a loving couple, their relationship another strategic alliance in the Wilson portfolio. "I'm sorry about your marriage," I offered, unsure how else to respond. She shook her head. "Don't be. It's been essentially over for years, maintained for appearances and family business connections. But after watching you rebuild so publicly, so successfully..." She trailed off, then met my eyes directly. "I need to know how you found the courage." The question caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because I'd never considered myself particularly courageous. I'd simply reached a breaking point where continuing in the Wilson world had become impossible. "I'm not sure courage is the right word," I said carefully. "It was more like recognition of who I'd become versus who I actually am. Eventually, the gap was too painful to sustain." Megan nodded, understanding immediately. "The Wilson gap. The space between your authentic self and the version they demand." It gets wider every year until you're essentially living as a character in their narrative. Her articulation of the experience was so precise that it startled a laugh from me. Exactly. But Megan, my situation was different. I had Eleanor's inheritance providing a safety net, a significant one. I know, but I have my design business. It's small but growing, and I've been secretly setting aside my own funds for years. Andrew doesn't know how successful it's become. The Wilsons all still think of it as my cute little hobby. The revelation of her private preparation resonated deeply. I'd thought myself alone in creating secret pockets of independence within the Wilson world, but Megan had been building her escape route even longer. Our drinks arrived, creating a natural pause in the conversation. As I added cream to my coffee, I considered how to respond. I wasn't a marriage counselor or a divorce attorney, and the Wilson family dynamics were extraordinarily complex. What are you really asking me, Megan? She set down her tea, her expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. 2 things. First, practical advice on extracting yourself from the Wilson orbit without being financially destroyed in the process. And second, she hesitated, then continued more quietly. Confirmation that there's life after the Wilson world. A good life. The second request touched me more than I'd expected. I remembered the paralyzing fear that had sometimes gripped me in the months before leaving, not just of practical consequences, but of identity dissolution. Who would I be without the structure of Wilson expectations, however confining they had been? There is life after the Wilsons, I confirmed, meeting her gaze steadily. A better, more authentic one. As for the practical aspects, I'm not qualified to give legal advice, but I can share my experience and connect you with Katherine Rodriguez, who handled my divorce brilliantly. Relief washed over Megan's face. That would be incredibly helpful. The Wilsons have always controlled access to legal and financial advisors. Finding someone truly independent has been challenging. They prefer it that way, I observed. Limited outside perspectives means limited challenges to their narrative. We spent the next hour discussing practical considerations, documentation she should gather, assets she should secure, support systems she should establish before making any public moves. The conversation felt surreal, strategizing another Wilson extraction when my own was still so recent, but also strangely healing. As we prepared to leave, Megan gripped my hand suddenly. There's something else you should know. The Wilson financial situation. It's worse than anyone outside the family realizes. The offshore accounts you discovered were just the surface. Richard has been taking increasingly desperate risks with client funds, trying to maintain their lifestyle and legacy despite several major investment failures. This revelation sent a chill through me. I'd suspected ethical problems in the business, but the scale Megan was suggesting went beyond anything I'd imagined. How bad? Bad enough that several board members have quietly resigned in recent months. Bad enough that James has been drinking heavily and arguing with Richard about strategy. Bad enough that Victoria has started liquidating her personal art collection without public explanation. I absorbed this information with a complex mix of emotions. Concern for clients who trusted the Wilson name, a twinge of vindication that my ethical concerns had been warranted, and surprising lack of satisfaction at the family's troubles. Why tell me this? Megan released my hand, gathering her belongings. Because you deserve to know your instincts were right, and because... She paused, zipping her handbag decisively. Because when everything falls apart, Victoria will look for someone to blame. Given recent events, your name will be high on that list. I've been legally cleared of any connection to Wilson Financial, I pointed out. The settlement specifically addresses that. Legal reality and Victoria's narrative have never been required to align, Megan replied with the weary knowledge of someone who had navigated Wilson dynamics for years. Just be prepared. The foundation you're establishing, your new business, They make you visible. Victoria may try to create connections between your rise and their potential fall. The warning was delivered without drama, but with clear sincerity. I thanked Megan, promised to connect her with Katherine, and we parted with a warmth neither of us had been able to express while under Wilson's surveillance. On the train back to Providence, I considered her warning. The idea of Victoria targeting me as a scapegoat for Wilson financial troubles wasn't entirely far-fetched. She'd built a career of protecting the family image at all costs, redirecting, blame and controlling narratives with surgical precision. Yet strangely, the possibility didn't frighten me as it once would have. Eleanor's inheritance had provided not just financial security, but a kind of psychological immunity to Wilson manipulation. My new life, while still forming, was built on foundations the Wilsons couldn't undermine: self-knowledge, authentic connections, and work aligned with my actual values, rather than imposed expectations. Back in Providence, I spent the evening finalizing plans for the Emma Bennett Foundation. The conversation with Megan had reinforced the importance of creating resources for women seeking independence from controlling relationships or systems, whether marital, familial, or professional. Financial education, legal guidance, community support, all elements I'd cobbled together during my own extraction could be formalized and expanded for others without Eleanor's extraordinary gift to ease the transition. I'd secured office space in downtown Providence, a former bank building with architectural details Eleanor would have appreciated, and hired a small staff with nonprofit experience to help shape the foundation's programs. The irony of establishing a financial education foundation in a former bank wasn't lost on me. Eleanor would have enjoyed the symbolism of transforming a traditional financial institution into a center for women's economic empowerment. As I reviewed the renovation plans for the space, my phone chimed with a news alert. Wilson Financial Group under federal investigation for potential securities violations. The headline confirmed Megan's warnings and suggested the situation was accelerating faster than even she had realized. I opened the article with a strange detachment, interested professionally and personally, but no longer emotionally invested in the Wilson narrative. The reporting was appropriately dry and factual, citing unnamed sources, claiming regulators were examining offshore accounts and potential misrepresentation to clients. Richard Wilson was quoted offering standard reassurances about cooperating fully and maintaining client confidence. James wasn't mentioned. As I set aside my phone, I realized I felt no satisfaction in the Wilsons' troubles, only a quiet confirmation that walking away had been the right choice, both personally and ethically. Whatever was happening at Wilson Financial represented the natural consequence of priorities and practices I'd glimpsed and questioned, questions that had been dismissed because I lacked the financial expertise to understand complex wealth management strategies. The next morning brought messages from 3 former Wilson family connections, acquaintances who had drifted away during the divorce, but now apparently saw value in reconnecting. Their inquiries were carefully worded but transparent in purpose, fishing for insider information about the family's troubles, seeking advantage in the shifting social landscape as the Wilson star potentially dimmed. I responded politely, but briefly to each, offering no insights or gossip. The Wilson family's business problems were their own to address, just as my rebuilding process was mine. The clear boundary felt empowering, another sign of healthy distance from patterns I'd once been absorbed in. Later that week, I hosted the first advisory board meeting for the Emma Bennett Foundation. The small group gathered around the conference table in my temporary office represented the diverse expertise I'd sought: financial educators, domestic violence advocates, career counselors, and women who had successfully rebuilt after significant life transitions. "Welcome, everyone," I began, surveying the faces of professionals who had responded enthusiastically to the Foundation's mission. "Thank you for joining this effort to create something meaningful from my great-aunt Eleanor's legacy." Over the next 3 hours, we refined the Foundation's programs, a financial literacy curriculum, emergency grants for women in transition, mentorship networks connecting those who had rebuilt with those just beginning the process. The energy in the room was collaborative and purposeful, focused on practical impact rather than prestigious appearances. As the meeting concluded, Maria Santos, a domestic violence advocate with 20 years of experience, lingered behind. "This foundation fills a critical gap," she said, gathering her materials. "Financial dependency keeps so many women trapped in situations they would otherwise leave. Your aunt's gift is going to create ripples you can't even imagine yet." Her words stayed with me as I walked home through downtown Providence that evening. Eleanor's inheritance had indeed been life-changing for me, but its true impact would be measured in how many others it eventually reached. How many women found pathways to independence and authentic living because of resources we were building. Back at my loft, I found an unexpected email waiting from James. In the months since our divorce, we'd had no direct communication, all necessary exchanges handled through attorneys. The subject line was simple: a genuine apology. I hesitated. Before opening it, wary of being pulled back into Wilson dynamics, especially given the firm's current troubles. But curiosity prevailed, and I found myself reading words that seemed to come from the James I'd initially fallen in love with, not the Wilson heir he'd become. "Emma, in light of recent events at Wilson Financial, I've been doing a lot of reflection. Not to excuse anything, but to understand how I lost sight of values that once mattered to me. How I betrayed not just you, but myself. You were right to walk away. Right about the questionable practices you glimpsed. Right about the cost of maintaining appearances over substance. I'm not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation. I simply wanted you to know that your courage in leaving forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding. Whatever happens with the firm, I'm finally asking the questions I should have been asking years ago about who I am separate from the Wilson name and expectations. I hope you're building something meaningful with your new freedom. You deserve that and more. James." I read the message twice, searching for hidden agendas or manipulations, but found none. It appeared to be simply what it claimed: a moment of genuine reflection prompted by circumstances forcing a reckoning with long-avoided truths. I didn't respond immediately, needing time to process this unexpected communication. The James who had written this email sounded more like the man I'd fallen in love with than the husband who had gradually disappeared into Wilson family expectations. Whether this represented temporary clarity brought on by crisis or a genuine awakening remained to be seen. What surprised me most was my own reaction: compassion rather than vindication. The Wilsons' controlling system had damaged James too, shaping him from childhood to prioritize appearance over authenticity, family legacy over personal integrity. His choices had been his own, certainly, but made within a context designed to limit his vision of what was possible or permissible. The following morning, I drafted a brief reply. "James, thank you for this message. I appreciate the reflection it represents. Whatever challenges you're facing, I hope they lead you toward greater authenticity and peace. I am indeed building something meaningful and finding myself in the process. Take care, Emma." Nothing more needed to be said. We had each moved into different life chapters, connected by history, but no longer defining each other's futures. I sent the email, then turned my attention to the day ahead. A meeting with architects about the foundation headquarters renovation, followed by lunch with a potential client for my analytics consultancy. The Wilson drama continued to unfold in business publications and Boston social circles over the following weeks. Richard stepped down as CEO to facilitate full cooperation with regulatory inquiries. Victoria canceled the annual Wilson Charitable Foundation Gala for the first time in 20 years, citing scheduling conflicts rather than acknowledging the obvious social awkwardness of hosting an extravagant party while under federal investigation. I followed these developments with the detached interest of someone watching a play they'd once performed in, but had now stepped away from. My focus remained on building, the foundation programs, my consulting business, my new home in Providence, and most importantly, my reclaimed sense of self. 6 months after the courthouse revelation of Eleanor's inheritance, I stood at the podium during the official opening of the Emma Bennett Foundation for Women's Financial Independence. The renovated bank building gleamed with thoughtful updates that honored its history while creating welcoming, accessible spaces for the women it would serve. Looking out at the gathered supporters, community partners, and staff, I felt a profound sense of rightness, not just about the foundation's mission, but about my place within it. Not as a Wilson-adjacent figure lending socially appropriate support to a charitable cause, but as a woman whose lived experience informed genuine commitment to helping others find their own paths to independence. My great-aunt Eleanor understood something fundamental, I told the audience. Financial resources aren't merely about security or status. They're about the freedom to make authentic choices, to live according to your own values rather than others' expectations. The inheritance she left me demonstrated that principle in my own life. This foundation extends that same possibility to women who may not have an Eleanor in their family, but who deserve the same opportunity to reclaim themselves. As applause filled the room, I caught sight of an unexpected figure standing at the back, Megan Wilson-Taylor, who offered a small smile and encouraging nod. Her presence represented another ripple effect of Eleanor's gift and my own journey. Inspiration for others to question constraints they'd previously accepted as inevitable. That evening, alone in my Providence loft, I opened the small wooden box containing Eleanor's personal effects that had been part of my inheritance. Among her travel mementos and favorite books was a journal I hadn't yet read, feeling it too intimate a connection to someone I was still grieving. But tonight, after launching the foundation that would carry her name and values forward, it felt appropriate to finally hear her voice directly. The journal wasn't a conventional diary, but a collection of observations, quotes that had resonated with her, and reflections on choices she'd made throughout her life. On the final page, dated just months before her death, she had written words that seemed addressed directly to me. To leave behind not just assets but possibility. This is the true legacy. To show another way is possible. To create space for authentic living in a world that rewards conformity. Money is simply a tool. Freedom is the real inheritance. Use both wisely, dear Emma. I closed the journal, tears blurring my vision briefly before I wiped them away. Eleanor had seen me clearly. My struggles within the Wilson world, my gradual erasure, my potential for something more authentic. Her inheritance hadn't just been financial. It had been a profound vote of confidence in who I might become when, freed from constraints I'd reluctantly accepted. Outside my windows, Providence continued its evening rhythms. Students walking toward downtown restaurants, professionals returning from work, artists heading to studios in neighboring buildings. I was becoming part of this community in ways I'd never managed in Boston, where Wilson connections and expectations had defined my social existence. Here, I was simply Emma Bennett, foundation director, business owner, woman rebuilding her life according to her own blueprint rather than someone else's architectural plans. The journey hadn't been simple or linear, and challenges certainly remained ahead. But standing in my own space, surrounded by choices that reflected my authentic values and priorities, I felt Eleanor's true inheritance taking root. Not just financial security, but the courage to live genuinely, whatever that might mean or require. The $70 million had shocked the courtroom and transformed my practical circumstances. But the real revelation had been discovering my own worth, a value not diminished by James's dismissal or enhanced by Eleanor's generosity, but inherent and constant, waiting only for me to fully recognize and claim it for myself. 1 year after, Eleanor's inheritance had transformed my life in that Boston courtroom. I stood at the edge of a crowded reception in the Emma Bennett Foundation's newly renovated headquarters. The former bank building now hummed with purposeful energy as women moved between resource stations, consulting with financial advisors, career counselors, and legal experts during our monthly open house. Quite a difference from the Wilson charity galas, observed Natalie, appearing at my side with 2 glasses of sparkling water. She handed me one, surveying the diverse gathering with approval. No designer gowns, no strategic networking, just actual human connection and practical help. I smiled, accepting the drink. Victoria would be appalled by the lack of champagne and appropriate social hierarchies. Yet somehow life continues, Natalie replied dryly. Speaking of the Wilsons, have you seen the news? I hadn't, having spent the day in back-to-back meetings with foundation staff and program participants. The first year of operations had brought constant refinements to our services as we better understood the needs of the women we served. Wilson Financial settled with federal regulators, Natalie continued, lowering her voice. Massive fines, structural reorganization, and Richard is officially retiring effective immediately. The news wasn't entirely surprising given the steady stream of revelations about the firm's practices over the past year, but the finality of it still landed with unexpected weight. Richard Wilson, the patriarchal figure who had loomed so large in my married life, forced into retirement by his own ethical failures. And James? I asked, surprised by my lingering concern for my ex-husband despite everything. Taking over as CEO, apparently. The settlement includes strict oversight provisions, but the board is positioning it as a generational transition and fresh start. I absorbed this information with mixed feelings. James had sent a few brief, respectful emails over the past year, professional in tone, focused mainly on matters related to the foundation or my consulting work where they occasionally intersected with Boston financial circles. He seemed to be making efforts toward greater authenticity, though whether those changes would survive the pressures of leading Wilson Financial remained to be seen. Good for him, I said finally. Taking over during a crisis will be challenging, but maybe it's the push he needs to rebuild the firm according to different values. Natalie studied me with a raised eyebrow. That's remarkably generous given everything that happened. I shrugged, watching a young mother across the room take notes during her consultation with one of our financial advisors, her toddler playing quietly beside her with toys from our family corner. Holding grudges takes energy I'd rather invest elsewhere. The Wilsons shaped a significant chapter of my life, but they don't determine what comes next. Speaking of what comes next, Natalie segued with deliberate casualness, that professor from Brown keeps looking over here. The one who helped develop our financial literacy curriculum. What's his name again? Dr. Marcus Reed, I supplied, fighting a smile at her transparent interest in my personal life. And he's not looking at me. He's monitoring how participants are responding to the workshop materials. Natalie hummed skeptically. That's definitely why he's attended every single one of these open houses for the past 6 months, when he could have just sent a graduate assistant. I couldn't quite suppress my blush. Marcus had indeed been a consistent presence at Foundation events since helping develop our core educational programs. Our professional relationship had gradually evolved to include coffee discussions about educational philosophy and economic justice that often extended well beyond their scheduled time. His thoughtful perspectives and genuine commitment to creating practical impact through academic knowledge had become something I looked forward to with increasing anticipation. We're colleagues with aligned interests, I insisted, though without much conviction. Of course, Natalie agreed with exaggerated seriousness. Just like you and James were networking for 6 months before you started dating. I recognize the signs, Emma. You light up differently when he's around. Before I could formulate a suitably dismissive response, Maria Santos approached with an enthusiastic participant in tow. Emma, this is Diane Larson. She completed our 6-week financial empowerment program and has something she'd like to share. with you." Diane, a woman perhaps a few years younger than me with determined eyes and a tentative smile, extended her hand. "I just wanted to thank you personally. 6 months ago, I was living in my car after leaving my husband of 12 years who controlled every cent and convinced me I couldn't manage without him. Today, I signed a lease on my own apartment and accepted a job offer with benefits." Her words hit me with unexpected force. This was why the foundation existed, not for recognition or to prove anything to the Wilsons, or even to honor Eleanor, though that remained important, but for women like Diane finding their way back to independence and dignity. "You did the hard work," I told her sincerely. "We just provided some tools." "Tools I wouldn't have found otherwise," she insisted. "Do you know how rare it is to find practical financial help without judgment or condescension? To be treated like someone capable of learning rather than someone who failed?" I did know, recalling my own experiences trying to educate myself about finance during my marriage, the dismissive responses from Wilson advisors, James's discomfort with my questions, Victoria's clear message that such matters weren't my concern. After Diane moved on to speak with other staff members, I found myself gravitating toward the quiet corner where Marcus was gathering feedback forms from workshop participants. His tall frame and thoughtful expression remained focused on his task until I approached, when he looked up with a smile that triggered an undeniable flutter of awareness. "Another successful event," he observed, shuffling papers into a neat stack. "The curriculum adjustments seem to be working well. Women are reporting higher confidence levels after just the introductory session." "Your insights made the difference," I acknowledged, connecting financial concepts to daily decision-making rather than abstract principles. "Just good pedagogy," he demurred, though his eyes reflected pleasure at the recognition. "Theory without application rarely creates lasting change." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment before he spoke again, his tone shifting from professional to personal. "I was wondering if you might be interested in continuing our discussion about community economic empowerment over dinner sometime. The Foundation's work has implications that connect to my research in ways I'd like to explore further." I felt Natalie's knowing gaze from across the room but didn't turn to meet it. "That sounds interesting," I replied, surprised by my own calm despite the internal flutter. "I'd like that." His smile widened. "Excellent. Tomorrow evening, there's a new farm-to-table place on Wickenden Street that's supposed to be excellent." As we finalized details, I experienced a moment of clarity. This simple, straightforward interaction represented everything that had been missing in my Wilson-influenced relationships. No calculation of social advantage, no consideration of family approval, just genuine connection based on shared interests and mutual respect. Later that evening, as the event wound down and staff began cleaning up, I retreated to my office to review the day's feedback and prepare for tomorrow's board meeting. The Foundation's first year had exceeded all expectations, serving over 300 women directly through workshops and individual consultations, awarding 40 emergency grants to women in crisis situations, and establishing partnerships with employers willing to provide opportunities for women rebuilding their careers. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Looking up, I was surprised to see Megan Wilson Taylor in my doorway, elegant as always, but with the same subtle changes I'd noticed during our Boston coffee meeting: more natural styling, less rigid posture, eyes more direct and present. "Hope I'm not interrupting," she said, stepping into the office when I gestured her forward. "I was in Providence meeting with a potential client and wanted to stop by. The building is beautiful, exactly the right balance of accessibility and inspiration." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely pleased by her unexpected visit. "How are you? How's the design business?" Megan settled into the chair across from my desk, her expression brightening. "Thriving, actually. I've established my own firm officially, Megan Taylor Design. The divorce was finalized last month." This news didn't surprise me. Katherine had mentioned representing Megan, though client confidentiality had prevented her from sharing details. "Congratulations on both counts," I said sincerely. "I couldn't have done it without your example," Megan replied. "Watching you walk away and build something meaningful showed me it was possible." I kept thinking, if Emma could rebuild after 6 years with the Wilsons, surely I can after 10. Her candor touched me. The situations were different. Eleanor's inheritance gave me options most women don't have. It wasn't about the money, Megan insisted. It was about the clarity, the willingness to value yourself enough to risk disapproval and uncertainty. Money just made the logistics easier. Her assessment aligned so closely with my own evolving understanding of Eleanor's true gift that it momentarily silenced me. The financial security had been life-changing, certainly, but the real inheritance had been the opportunity to reclaim my authentic identity and purpose. "How are the Wilsons handling everything?" I asked, curious about the family's response to both the business settlement and Megan's departure. She smiled wryly. "About as well as you'd expect. Victoria is in full damage control mode, rewriting family history and corporate narratives with impressive efficiency. Andrew is angry but compliant, following Richard's directives to protect what remains of the family reputation. And James..." She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. "James is different. The federal investigation and settlement forced a kind of reckoning I hadn't expected from him. He's actually implementing significant reforms at the firm: transparency protocols, ethical investment standards, diverse hiring practices." This aligned with the impression I'd formed from our limited exchanges over the past year. James seemed to be finding his way toward something more authentic, though the journey was clearly complicated by family pressures and legacy expectations. "I'm glad," I said genuinely. "The Wilson name still matters to a lot of people. Using it to build something better seems like the right path." Megan nodded, then reached into her handbag and extracted a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "This is actually why I wanted to see you in person. I found this while clearing out my things from the Wilson estate after the divorce. I thought you should have it." Curious, I unwrapped the package to find a small leather-bound book. Opening it, I discovered it was a collection of photographs, images of Eleanor from various Wilson family events over the years I'd been married to James. Eleanor at our wedding, her expression watchful rather than celebratory. Eleanor at a Christmas gathering, engaged in what appeared to be intense conversation with James, while Victoria looked on disapprovingly. Eleanor and I at the Wilson Summer Gala 3 years into my marriage, her hand protectively on my arm as Victoria held court across the room. "I started noticing her during my own awakening process," Megan explained. "How she always seemed to be watching, evaluating, particularly when it came to you. I realized she was the only person in those rooms who saw the dynamics clearly, who recognized what was happening to you and didn't pretend it was normal or necessary." The images blurred slightly as unexpected tears filled my eyes. I'd always known Eleanor understood my struggles within the Wilson world, but seeing visual evidence of her quiet vigilance, her consistent presence during those years of gradual erasure, moved me deeply. Victoria tried to exclude her from most events, I remembered, tracing Eleanor's determined face in one photograph. Called her disruptive and inappropriate, but James always insisted she be included because he knew it mattered to me. "The Wilsons never understood her," Megan observed. "They saw an eccentric old woman with outdated views and insufficient appreciation for their social importance. They missed the wisdom and clarity that came from living life on her own terms." "Thank you for this," I said, carefully closing the book. "It means more than I can express." Megan rose to leave, glancing at her watch. "I should go. I have a client dinner in Boston tonight. But I wanted you to know that your foundation's work matters beyond the women it directly serves. It's creating ripples of possibility for women who might never walk through these doors." After she departed, I remained at my desk, paging through the photographs again. Each image captured a moment I'd experienced but hadn't fully seen. The subtle dynamics of power and control that had gradually reshaped my understanding of myself during my years as a Wilson. Eleanor had seen it all clearly, had recognized the danger long before I'd been willing to acknowledge it. Her inheritance hadn't been an impulsive decision or merely a financial bequest. It had been a carefully considered intervention by someone who had watched me slowly disappearing and had created an escape route I couldn't yet envision for myself. The realization brought both gratitude and determination to honor that clear-sighted love by extending similar possibilities to others. Not everyone had an Eleanor in their corner, but perhaps the foundation could serve that role for women facing their own versions of the gilded cages I'd experienced. My phone chimed with a text message from Marcus confirming our dinner plans for the following evening. The simple, straightforward communication triggered a smile and a flutter of anticipation untainted by calculation or concern about appropriate appearances. Whatever might develop between us would unfold naturally, based on genuine connection rather than external expectations or strategic advantage. The contrast with my carefully orchestrated courtship with James couldn't have been more stark. There had been genuine feeling there too initially, but always shaped and constrained by Wilson considerations: suitable restaurants, appropriate topics, relationship milestones on a timeline that aligned with family expectations and business advantages. As I gathered my things to leave for the evening, a final notification appeared on my phone, an email from Victoria Wilson. Seeing her name in my inbox after months of silence sent a momentary chill through me. Opening it with cautious curiosity, I found a surprisingly brief message. Emma, circumstances have necessitated reflection on past choices and their consequences. While we will likely never share perspectives on many matters, I find myself recognizing certain truths that warrant acknowledgement. Your assessment of Wilson Financial's ethical vulnerabilities was more accurate than I was willing to admit at the time. Had we heeded, rather than dismissed your concerns, certain painful developments might have been avoided. This is not an apology, but an acknowledgement of perception I previously denied. Victoria Wilson. I read the message twice, absorbing its careful wording and limited scope. Not an apology, as she explicitly stated, but perhaps as close to one as Victoria Wilson was, capable of offering, an acknowledgement of my perception, if not yet a full recognition of her own role in creating the culture that had enabled Wilson Financial's ethical failures. The message required no response, and I offered none. Victoria hadn't reached out, seeking forgiveness or reconciliation, merely to record an acknowledgement that perhaps helped her process the dramatic changes in her family's circumstances. Whether it represented genuine growth or merely strategic adaptation to new realities was impossible to determine from a single email, and ultimately not my concern. As I walked through the foundation's main space toward the exit, I passed the wall where photographs of program participants shared their stories of transition and rebuilding. Women of diverse ages, backgrounds, and circumstances, each finding their way toward greater independence and authenticity. Among them hung a single portrait of Eleanor, her clear eyes and determined expression watching over the space that bore her name and extended her values. "We're making a difference," I told her silently. "Not just with money, but with the message that women deserve financial literacy, economic independence, and authentic choices." Outside, Providence had transformed into a vibrant spring evening. Sidewalk cafes filled with people enjoying the lingering daylight, street musicians creating pockets of melody on corners. I chose to walk rather than drive, savoring the freedom of movement without schedule or scrutiny. My apartment was 20 minutes away by foot, a pleasant distance that allowed transition between work and home, public and private selves. The following evening, as I prepared for dinner with Marcus, I found myself experiencing an unfamiliar combination of anticipation and ease. My outfit, a deep teal dress I'd chosen solely because I loved the color, hadn't been subjected to imagined Wilson assessment. My apartment, filled with books, art, and objects selected for personal meaning rather than visitor impressions, reflected authentic preferences rather than carefully calculated presentations. The woman in my mirror was someone I recognized and valued. Emma Bennett, whole and sufficient, engaged in meaningful work, open to new connections, but no longer seeking external validation to justify her existence. The journey from that Boston courtroom to this moment hadn't been simple or linear, but each step had carried me closer to genuine integrity between my outer life and inner values. When the doorbell rang announcing Marcus's arrival, I moved to answer it without the mental checklist that had accompanied such moments during my Wilson years. No quick survey for potential criticisms, no preparation for appropriate conversational topics, no consideration of how this interaction might be perceived by family arbiters. Instead, I opened the door with simple pleasure at seeing him, noticing the slight nervousness behind his smile that matched my own. The natural uncertainty of two people navigating potential connection without predetermined scripts or expectations. "Ready?" he asked, his genuine warmth evident in both expression and tone. "Absolutely," I replied, meaning it completely. 2 years after James had dismissed me as nothing in that Boston courtroom, I stepped into the spring evening beside a man who saw me clearly because I now saw myself with equal clarity. Whatever developed between us would be authentic rather than strategic, based on mutual recognition rather than calculated advantage. Eleanor's inheritance had provided the practical means for this transformation, but the journey itself had been mine, from adaptive erasure to genuine presence, from externally determined value to internally generated worth. The money had opened doors, but I had chosen which thresholds to cross, which spaces to create, which connections to nurture. As Marcus and I walked toward the restaurant, discussing ideas for expanding the Foundation's educational programs into local high schools, I felt Eleanor's ongoing presence, not as constraint or obligation, but as loving witness to the authentic life her gift had helped make possible. Not just financial security, but the deeper freedom to live according to my own values and vision. The true inheritance, I realized, had never been about the money at all. It had been about possibility, the chance to rediscover and reclaim myself after years of careful erasure, to build a life measured by internal integrity rather than external approval, to create meaning through connection and contribution rather than acquisition and appearance. In that Boston courtroom, James had claimed I had nothing, and in material terms, he'd believed himself correct. But as I moved through this spring evening in Providence 2 years later, engaged in meaningful work, surrounded by authentic connections, creating opportunities for other women seeking similar liberation, I recognized the profound inaccuracy of his assessment. I hadn't been nothing. I had simply been invisible to those who measured value in limited and limiting ways. Eleanor had seen me clearly when the Wilsons couldn't or wouldn't, had recognized worth they denied and potential they dismissed. Her inheritance had been a vote of confidence in that alternative valuation, a material manifestation of her belief in possibilities beyond Wilson metrics and measures. The $70 million had shocked that Boston courtroom into silence. But the true revelation had been quieter and more profound. The recognition that worth isn't determined by others' assessments, that value isn't measured by external validation or material accumulation. That authenticity offers a richness that conformity can never provide. As Marcus held the restaurant door open, his expression reflecting genuine interest and respect rather than calculated advantage, I stepped forward into the warmth and light, not as Emma Wilson, carefully crafted accessory to someone else's narrative, but as Emma Bennett, author of her own unfolding story, heir to Eleanor's true legacy of authentic living and meaningful contribution. The $70 million had changed my practical circumstances dramatically. But the profound transformation had been internal, from someone who measured her value through others' assessments to someone who recognized her inherent worth regardless of external validation or material circumstances. That recognition, that reclamation of authentic selfhood, was Eleanor's true gift, and one I now worked to extend to other women through the Foundation's programs and resources. Not everyone would receive a multi-million-dollar inheritance as catalyst for their liberation, but perhaps they could find other pathways to the same essential recognition, that they deserved lives of dignity, independence, and authentic choice. Inside the restaurant, warmed by good food, engaged conversation, and genuine connection, I raised my glass in a silent toast to Eleanor, to her clear-sighted love, her practical generosity, and most importantly, her living example of a woman who had defined success on her own terms rather than accepting limited external definitions or expectations. To possibility, I said aloud, including Marcus in the toast without explaining its deeper significance. To possibility, he echoed, his expression suggesting he understood more than my words conveyed. And to authentic paths forward, wherever they might lead. Our glasses clinked gently, a simple sound that seemed to affirm both past journeys and future potential, the ongoing process of becoming more fully ourselves rather than convenient characters in someone else's narrative. The $70 million had been announced in that Boston courtroom 2 years ago, but the true inheritance continued to unfold each day, in choices made from authenticity rather than adaptation, in connections based on mutual recognition, rather than strategic advantage, in work aligned with genuine values rather than external expectations. In claiming that inheritance, not just the financial resources but the deeper legacy of authentic living, I had discovered wealth that couldn't be quantified by accountants or dismissed by ex-husbands, the immeasurable richness of a life lived in integrity with one's true self, values, and purpose. 5 years to the day after that transformative courtroom moment, I stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Providence Civic Center, surveying the gathered crowd of over 300 attendees at the Emma Bennett Foundation's annual Women's Economic Empowerment Conference. The event had grown from a small workshop series into a nationally recognized gathering of financial educators, advocates, business leaders, and most importantly, women at various stages of rebuilding their lives. Welcome to our 5th annual conference, I began, feeling the familiar blend of pride and purpose that accompanied these gatherings. When Emma Bennett left me her inheritance 5 years ago, she created possibility where others saw only endings. Today, we continue that legacy by recognizing that economic independence isn't just about money. It's about the freedom to make authentic choices and live according to your own values. The audience included familiar faces, program graduates, now serving as mentors, corporate partners funding scholarship programs, community leaders implementing our financial literacy curriculum in schools and shelters. But most meaningful were the newcomers, women attending their first conference with expressions that shifted between uncertainty and hope. The same combination I'd felt in those early months after leaving the Wilson world behind. As I introduced our keynote speaker, a nationally recognized economist who had begun her career as a single mother on public assistance, I caught sight of Marcus slipping into a seat at the back of the room. Despite his busy schedule as department chair at Brown, he rarely missed foundation events. His steady support over the past 4 years, one of many gifts in my post-Wilson life. Our relationship had evolved naturally from professional collaboration to friendship to deeper partnership, unburdened by external expectations or strategic calculations. 2 years ago, he had moved into my Providence loft, the decision made simply because it brought us both joy, rather than because it aligned with someone else's timeline or expectations. Following the keynote address, I participated in a panel discussion with 3 foundation program graduates now leading successful businesses or nonprofits. Their journeys resonated with aspects of my own experience while reflecting unique challenges and triumphs. Listening to them articulate lessons learned and wisdom gained, I recognized how the Foundation's work had evolved beyond my personal story into a broader movement for women's economic empowerment. During the networking lunch that followed, I circulated among tables, connecting program participants with potential mentors and employers. This intentional matchmaking had become one of our most effective strategies, creating pathways to opportunity through personal connections rather than impersonal applications. Ms. Bennett? I turned to find a woman perhaps a decade younger than me, professionally dressed, but with the slight hesitancy of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. "I'm Jessica Winters," she introduced herself. "I'm here representing the Wilson Family Foundation. Victoria Wilson asked me to deliver this personally." She extended an envelope bearing the Wilson family crest, a sight that once would have triggered anxiety, but now provoked mere curiosity. Taking it with a polite thank you, I tucked it into my portfolio to read later, focusing instead on ensuring Jessica felt welcome at the event. "This is your first time attending our conference?" I asked, guiding her toward the dessert table where conversations tended to flow more naturally. "Yes, I joined the Wilson Foundation as program director 3 months ago." She hesitated before adding, "Your foundation's model is actually part of why they hired me. Victoria mentioned your work specifically during my interview." This unexpected information genuinely surprised me. The Wilson Family Foundation had traditionally focused on arts patronage and educational scholarships to prestigious institutions, safe, prestigious causes that enhanced the family's social standing without challenging existing power structures. "That's interesting," I managed, selecting a small pastry to give myself a moment to process this revelation. "What direction is the Wilson Foundation taking now?" "A significant shift toward women's economic empowerment and financial education," Jessica explained, her professional demeanor warming with evident passion for the work. "Victoria has been particularly interested in programming for women in career transitions or recovering from financial setbacks." The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria Wilson, who had once dismissed my interest in finance as inappropriate and my career ambitions as incompatible with being a proper Wilson wife, now apparently championing women's economic empowerment. Whether this represented genuine evolution or strategic repositioning in light of the family's reduced social standing remained unclear. "Well, we're always open to collaboration that advances our mission," I offered sincerely. "Feel free to reach out if you'd like to discuss potential partnerships." As Jessica moved on to network with other attendees, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically circumstances had changed. 5 years ago, I had been fighting for basic dignity and independence in a Boston courtroom. Today, Wilson representatives were approaching me as a respected peer in the nonprofit world. Later that afternoon, as the conference transitioned into breakout sessions, I retreated briefly to my office to review notes for my closing remarks, and finally opened Victoria's envelope. Inside was a formal invitation to the Wilson Family Foundation's upcoming gala in Boston, accompanied by a handwritten note. "Emma, the Wilson Foundation is establishing a scholarship program for women pursuing financial education after life transitions. We would be honored if you would consider serving on the advisory committee, lending your expertise to ensure meaningful impact. The gala will announce this initiative publicly. Whatever your decision, your foundation's work deserves recognition for its influence on our evolving mission. Victoria Wilson." The note contained no personal warmth or acknowledgement of our complex history, yet represented a significant shift from Victoria's previous dismissive attitude toward my work and capabilities. Whether motivated by genuine respect or practical recognition that the Emma Bennett Foundation had become a leader in women's economic empowerment, the invitation suggested Victoria had at least partially reassessed her previous judgments. I set the invitation aside, deciding to consider it thoughtfully rather than respond from immediate reaction. My relationship with the Wilson family had evolved from painful entanglement to professional distance, a healthy separation that allowed me to acknowledge their existence without being defined by my connection to them. The foundation's closing reception that evening transformed the Civic Center's terrace into a celebration of accomplishment and possibility. String lights twinkled overhead as program graduates, supporters, and community partners mingled in the warm spring air. Marcus found me near the stone balustrade overlooking downtown Providence, his presence a comforting constant in my life. "Successful day?" he asked, offering a glass of sparkling water. "Beyond expectations," I confirmed, accepting the drink gratefully. Registration was 30% higher than last year, and the scholarship fund exceeded our target by nearly double. He smiled, studying my expression with the perceptiveness that had first drawn me to him. "And yet something's on your mind." I showed him Victoria's invitation, watching as he read it with raised eyebrows. His familiarity with my history made lengthy explanations unnecessary. He understood immediately the complexity of this gesture, from my former mother-in-law. "Interesting," he observed, returning the card. "What are you thinking?" "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. 5 years ago, I would have dismissed it immediately as manipulation. Now, I paused, considering the earnest Program Director Victoria had sent. I wonder if it might represent genuine evolution, or at least recognition that the work matters regardless of personal histories. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "The question isn't really about Victoria's motivations, though, is it? It's about what serving on their advisory committee would mean for you, and for the women both foundations aim to serve." His gentle redirection to the practical impact rather than emotional response exemplified why our relationship worked so well. Marcus never told me what to think or feel, but consistently helped me clarify my own priorities and values. "You're right," I acknowledged. "If their initiative helps women gain financial independence, my personal feelings about the Wilson family shouldn't be the deciding factor." As the evening continued, I found myself drawn into conversation with a small group of first-time attendees, women at various stages of rebuilding after relationships or circumstances that had limited their economic agency. Listening to their questions and insights, I recognized echoes of my own journey while appreciating the unique challenges each faced. "I keep waiting to feel confident enough," admitted one woman, a former executive assistant now retraining for financial services, after leaving a controlling marriage. "Like there's some magical point where I'll be certain I'm making the right choices." "That certainty doesn't come all at once," I told her, remembering my own tentative steps in those early months after the divorce. "It builds gradually through small decisions that align with your actual values rather than someone else's expectations. Eventually, you realize you've been trusting yourself all along." Later that night, as Marcus and I walked home along Providence's riverside path, the lights of downtown reflected in the water alongside the moon's gentle illumination. 5 years of building a life aligned with my authentic values had transformed Providence from an escape destination into a true home, a community where I belonged because of who I was rather than whose wife I had been. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something," Marcus said as we paused on a pedestrian bridge. The city spread before us in a tapestry of light and shadow. The university offered me a research sabbatical next year, full funding to expand the economic justice curriculum we've been developing. "That's wonderful," I replied sincerely, knowing how passionate he was about making financial education more accessible and relevant. "When would it start?" "That's the thing," he continued, turning to face me directly. "There's an opportunity to implement the curriculum through community organizations in several cities. I'd need to travel extensively for about 6 months." I heard the unasked question in his statement, whether this would disrupt what we'd built together, whether the foundation's needs would make such extended absence impractical. "You should absolutely do it," I said without hesitation. "It's important work, and perfectly timed with the Foundation's expansion into curriculum licensing. In fact, we might find ways to align efforts." The relief and appreciation in his expression reminded me again of how different this relationship was from my marriage to James. No strategic calculations about career advancement versus family appearance. No deference to external authorities. Determining acceptable choices. just two adults supporting each other's meaningful work while maintaining the connection that enriched both lives. "There's another element to consider," Marcus added, reaching into his pocket and producing a small box that immediately accelerated my heartbeat. "This isn't because of the sabbatical or any external timeline. It's simply because I love you and want to build a life with you, whatever shape that takes." He opened the box to reveal a ring unlike anything the Wilsons would have deemed appropriate for a significant life milestone. No massive diamond or ostentatious setting, but a unique design featuring a deep blue sapphire surrounded by smaller stones in an asymmetrical pattern that somehow perfectly captured both elegance and originality. "Emma Bennett, will you marry me? Not to become someone different or to fit some external expectation, but simply because we're better together than apart, while still remaining fully ourselves." The question, and its careful wording acknowledging, "My past experience touched me deeply." This wasn't a proposal shaped by social obligation or family expectation, but a genuine invitation to continue building something meaningful together. "Yes," I answered simply, emotions making elaborate response impossible. As he slipped the ring onto my finger, I was struck by the profound difference between this moment and my engagement to James. No calculation of social advantage, no consideration of family approval, no sense of entering a role to be performed, rather than a partnership to be lived. We continued our walk home, making no immediate plans or announcements, simply enjoying the private acknowledgement of commitment before sharing it with others. This too felt like freedom, the ability to experience significant moments without immediate concern for external perception or presentation. The following morning, I arrived at the foundation offices early, intending to complete paperwork before the final day of conference activities began. Maria Santos, now our operations director, greeted me with her usual efficiency and direct manner. "The session evaluations from yesterday were overwhelmingly positive," she reported, handing me a summary. "And we've already received 28 requests for curriculum licensing from organizations in other states." "That's excellent," I replied, reviewing the figures with satisfaction. "Let's schedule a team meeting next week to discuss expansion capacity." Maria nodded, then smiled with unexpected warmth. "The ring is beautiful, by the way. Congratulations." I glanced down, momentarily surprised that she'd noticed. "Thank you. It just happened last night. We haven't told anyone yet." "Some things shine through regardless," she observed with uncharacteristic sentiment before returning to her practical manner. "The financial literacy panel starts in 30 minutes. Your introduction notes are on your desk." As she departed, I found myself reflecting on her comment about things that shine through. 5 years ago, I had been so thoroughly diminished within the Wilson world that my authentic self had nearly disappeared beneath carefully maintained appearances. Now, even unannounced joy was immediately visible to those who knew me well. Tao. Conference's final day unfolded with energetic participation and meaningful connections. During the closing session, I shared the Foundation's 5-year impact statistics. Over 2,000 women directly served through programs, $15 million in grants and scholarships awarded, financial literacy curriculum implemented, in 112 schools and community organizations across the country. But numbers alone don't capture the true impact, I told the assembled participants. Each statistic represents a woman reclaiming her agency, her dignity, her right to make authentic choices about her own life and resources. Each number contains a story of transformation, not just in financial circumstances, but in self-perception and possibility. As I spoke these words, I caught sight of a familiar figure slipping into the back of the auditorium, James Wilson, looking simultaneously familiar and strange after nearly 5 years without direct contact. Our communication had been limited to occasional professional emails related to the financial education field, where our paths sometimes indirectly crossed. His presence was unexpected, but not entirely surprising. The conference had gained national recognition, and Wilson Financial had been repositioning itself as a leader in ethical investing and financial education since emerging from regulatory oversight 2 years earlier. James had successfully steered the firm through its restructuring, rebuilding both operational integrity and public trust, according to industry publications. I completed my remarks without acknowledging his presence, focusing instead on the women, whose courage and determination the conference was designed to celebrate. As the session concluded and attendees began networking one final time, James approached the stage, his expression reflecting a complex mixture of emotions I could still read despite the years of separation. "Congratulations, Emma," he said simply, extending his hand professionally. "What you've built here is remarkable." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the handshake briefly. "The foundation team deserves most of the credit. The vision is clearly yours," he countered with unexpected directness. "Eleanor would be proud of how you've extended her legacy." The mention of Eleanor surprised me. James had rarely spoken of her during our marriage, finding her directness and unconventional perspectives uncomfortable. That he would reference her now suggested a level of reflection I hadn't anticipated. "I hope so," I acknowledged. "Her gift was about more than money. It was about possibility." James nodded, his expression surprisingly unguarded. "I've thought a lot about possibility over the past 5 years, about paths not taken and choices that seemed inevitable, but weren't." The conversation might once have triggered complicated emotions: regret, anger, vindication. But standing in the conference center surrounded by evidence of all I'd built since walking away from the Wilson world, I felt only a calm recognition of how thoroughly that chapter had closed. "We all have those reflections," I replied neutrally. "The important thing is learning from them." "Which is partly why I'm here," James explained. "Wilson Financial is establishing a foundation for financial literacy education. Jessica Winters mentioned your organization has the most comprehensive curriculum available. We'd like to discuss potential licensing arrangements." The request was professional, appropriate, and entirely focused on the foundation's work rather than our personal history. It reflected precisely the kind of arm's-length relationship that allowed productive interaction without reopening old wounds. "Maria Santos handles our curriculum partnerships," I replied, gesturing toward where she stood organizing evaluation forms. "She can schedule a meeting with our education team to discuss possibilities." James accepted this redirection gracefully, perhaps recognizing that maintaining professional boundaries benefited us both. As he moved to introduce himself to Maria, I noticed the ring on my finger catching the light, a tangible symbol of the life I'd built since that Boston courtroom confrontation 5 years earlier. Marcus appeared at my side, having just concluded his own conference session on integrating financial education into community college curricula. His presence felt natural and grounding, a partnership based on mutual respect and recognition rather than prescribed roles or expectations. "Was that James Wilson?" he asked quietly, watching the interaction between Maria and my ex-husband with mild curiosity rather than concern. "Yes," I confirmed. "Apparently Wilson Financial is interested in our financial literacy curriculum." "Full circle moment," Marcus observed thoughtfully. "The skills and interests they once dismissed are now resources they need." His observation captured the irony perfectly, though without the bitterness that might once have accompanied such recognition. The Wilsons' dismissal of my interests and capabilities had ultimately freed me to develop them more fully elsewhere, to build something meaningful that now stood independently regardless of their belated recognition. Later that evening, as the conference concluded and the foundation team gathered for a celebratory dinner, I found myself seated beside Angela Foster, our newest board member and a prominent advocate for women's economic justice. She'd been observing interactions throughout the conference with the perceptiveness that made her such a valuable addition to our leadership. "Your foundation has created something remarkable," she noted, surveying the diverse gathering of staff, volunteers, and program graduates sharing the long table. Not just programs and resources, but a genuine community of women supporting each other's growth and independence. That's the element I'm most proud of, I acknowledged. The money matters. Practical support makes real difference. But the community sustains the change over time. Angela nodded thoughtfully. I noticed Victoria Wilson's representative here yesterday, and James Wilson today. The family seems quite interested in your model. Evolution happens in unexpected places sometimes, I replied diplomatically. True, Angela agreed with a knowing smile. Though it's worth remembering who catalyzes that evolution. 5 years ago, you walked away from one of Boston's most powerful families with nothing but your integrity and Eleanor's inheritance. Now, they're following your lead in women's financial empowerment work. That's not just personal success, it's cultural impact. Her framing startled me slightly. I'd been so focused on building the foundation's work that I rarely considered its broader influence, particularly on the world I'd left behind. That Victoria and James were now allocating Wilson resources toward women's economic empowerment represented a significant shift from their previous priorities and perspectives. I suppose there's satisfaction in that, I conceded, though it's not why we do the work. Of course not, Angela agreed. But impact comes in many forms. Sometimes it's the individual woman who gains independence. Sometimes it's the institution that changes direction in response to new models of what's possible. As the evening progressed, I found myself reflecting on these broader ripples from the Foundation's work and my own journey. The $70 million announced in that Boston's courtroom had been shocking and transformative, but the true revelation had been recognizing my own worth independent of Wilson validation or material circumstances. A recognition that had shaped everything that followed. When dinner concluded and farewells began, I stepped outside the restaurant to enjoy a moment of quiet reflection before joining the final gatherings. Providence had transformed from refuge to home over these 5 years, a place where I belonged because of authentic connections rather than strategic associations. A text message from Natalie appeared on my phone. Saw the conference coverage in the Providence Journal. Eleanor would be doing cartwheels. Also, when were you planning to mention the ring? I smiled, tapping a quick reply promising details. Soon, then slipped the phone back into my purse as Marcus joined me on the restaurant's patio. His quiet presence beside me felt like the most natural thing in the world, supportive without being possessive, connected without being confining. Thinking about Eleanor? He asked perceptively. Among other things, I confirmed. It's been exactly 5 years since that courtroom moment when everything changed. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times it feels like a different lifetime. In many ways it was, he observed. You've built something extraordinary since then. Not just the foundation, but a life aligned with your authentic values. His assessment resonated deeply. The journey from that Boston courtroom to this Providence evening hadn't been simple or direct, but each step had moved me closer to genuine integration between outer circumstances and inner truth. We should probably tell people about this, I said, glancing down at the ring that had generated surprisingly few comments throughout the busy conference day. Natalie already noticed from news photos. Marcus laughed softly. Whenever you're ready. There's no prescribed timeline or announcement. Protocol. Just whatever feels right to us. His words captured exactly why our relationship worked. The consistent recognition that choices should serve authentic needs rather than external expectations. So different from my years in the Wilson orbit, where every decision had been evaluated against family traditions and social appearances. As we returned inside to rejoin the gathering, I caught sight of my reflection in the restaurant's window, a woman I recognized completely, engaged in meaningful work, surrounded by genuine relationships, moving through the world with clarity and purpose. Not because a $70 million inheritance had been announced in a courtroom 5 years earlier, but because that moment had catalyzed a deeper reclamation of self-worth no dollar amount could measure. James had claimed I had nothing that day in court, believing himself accurate in material terms. But his assessment had revealed more about his limited metrics of value than about my actual worth. Eleanor had seen what the Wilsons couldn't, the potential waiting to be liberated from constraints they had imposed and I had accepted. 5 years later, surrounded by evidence of all that had grown from that liberation, I silently thanked Eleanor for the true inheritance she'd provided. Not just financial resources, but the profound gift of possibility. The chance to discover who Emma Bennett might become when freed from expectations that had never truly fit. The opportunity to build a life measured by authenticity rather than appearances, by genuine impact rather than social position. The $70 million had opened doors, but I had chosen which thresholds to cross, which spaces to create, which connections to nurture. The resulting life, rich with meaning, purpose, and genuine relationship, represented wealth that couldn't be quantified in financial terms or dismissed by limited perspectives. As I rejoined the celebration, accepting congratulations from colleagues who had finally noticed the ring, sharing meaningful moments with program graduates whose lives had transformed alongside my own, I felt Eleanor's continuing presence not as obligation, but as loving witness to possibilities fulfilled and still unfolding. The inheritance continued to generate returns no financial advisor could have projected. In lives reclaimed, in confidence restored, in authentic choices made, possible for thousands of women beyond the one woman in that Boston courtroom 5 years earlier. In claiming that inheritance, not just the financial resources but the deeper legacy of authentic living, I had discovered wealth beyond measure. The immeasurable richness of a life lived in integrity with one's true self, values, and purpose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.